All right, welcome again to our Water Quality Wednesday Best Management Practice Conservation Deep Dive. My name is Bridget Moneymaker and my co-host, Paige Peterson. And we have two other Water Quality Wednesdays coming up here. February 16th and March 23rd, nitrogen efficiency and loss prevention and emerging tech and water quality. And we also, coming up, we also have another webinar, which is recently added, a new public input webinar for Western Lake Erie Basin conservation practices. We will go into more depth a little bit about this at the end, but we just wanted to put this on your radar and give you a chance to register for it as it is coming up soon. All right, I'm now going to hand over to Paige for a few more introductions and housekeeping.
I was muted. I said thank you. I'm Paige, and I cover Putnam, Harding, or that's wrong. I'm sorry. Hancock, Harding, and Putnam County. I'm trying to read off the screen. And then Bridget already introduced herself. And we have a couple other water quality associates on here with us, Jordan and Matt. And I apologize, the counties are not right. Bridget fixed it on hers before we started this, and then I had to screen share. So those are not the right counties, but they can speak on that later. We do have some awesome speakers here that we're excited about. Stephen Jackman is our first one, and he's a professor at Wright State University Lake Campus. You'll also hear from our very own Bruce Clevenger. He's an OSU Extension Associate Professor, Area Leader, and A&R Educator. And then we also have two panelists, Joe Gearing, he's the Drainage Engineer for Allen County, and Aaron Heilers, and he's the Project Manager for Blanchard River Demo Farms. Each of their contacts are displayed here on the screen, but they will be available at the end of this presentation to answer your questions. Really quickly, I want to run through our schedule. We'll begin with Bridget giving an overview of conservation drainage. Then we'll go to saturated buffers specifically, and you will watch a couple videos, and then you'll hear from Stephen Jackman. And then we'll flip over to drainage water management, and you'll see some cool videos there too, and then hear from Bruce. And then I will give you an overview on resources and funding, and then we'll wrap up with a Q&A panel. You all can drop questions in the chat or Q&A box as we're going through, and we'll either try to grab them as we go through or specifically at the end of the presentation. And now I'm going to hand it back off to Bridget.
Thank you, Paige. All right, for a quick intro before we go into our specific conservation practices, what do we mean when we talk about conservation drainage? Okay, go to the next slide. As many ag producers know, when it comes to water, there's often too much of it or not enough. So there's no way to actually control the weather to prevent extreme events, but there are ways to fine-tune water drainage and delivery on your own farm that can make a big difference in your day-to-day operations. Incorporating some of these conservation drainage practices that we're going to talk about today can help build your farm's overall resilience and make your production more likely to weather future extremes like the two shown here. In addition to building overall resiliency, conservation drainage practices can also provide effective strategies to reduce the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus leaving fields and entering downstream waterways. Which here with our Extension Water Quality Associates, we all live in the Western Lake Erie Basin, so that means everything is flowing directly into Lake Erie. So what is conservation drainage? At its most basic level, it asks how we can better use drainage systems in a way that makes them part of the solution and not part of the problem. And here in the Midwest, subsurface tile drainage is very common water quality practice. So often you'll hear the term conservation drainage specifically refer to practices that reduce nutrient loads on tile draining soils. For today's webinar, we will be focusing on two specific practices to go a little bit more in depth. And they do require tile drainage, but there are several types of management strategies that can improve drainage without tiles. Practices that modify the cropping system, for example, winter cover crops, incorporating perennials, or focusing on more targeted nitrogen management. And then we also have a great best management practice website with the OSU extension. It has an extensive roundup of these practices and more. It's organized by landscape effect and includes applicable NRCS standards. So definitely check that website out for more information on some of the practices we aren't talking about today. So as we mentioned, the benefits of conservation practice are quite expansive. And if something like improved soil health or crop resiliency are some of your production goals for the future, investing in a more targeted conservation drainage strategy is something we're going to provide more information on for our webinar today, and hope to give you a better understanding if you're interested in incorporating some of these practices, because you can see the benefits can be quite expansive for your goals. And to sum up this intro section, we just want to reiterate there's no universal approach for improving drainage and your water quality. A lot of these practices can and should be used in combination, and it's often mentioned that a suite of water quality improvement approaches might be needed across your production to meet some of those goals. So if you already implemented some of these options and you're looking to add another, like we said, more targeted approach, we hope today will be the place you can find some of those answers. And we'll be able to go a little bit more in depth. So now Paige is going to show 2 3-minute videos, so they're very short, that will provide a really great overview of saturated buffers. And then we're going to set the stage for Dr. Jackman from Wright State University. Will provide us with a few remarks.
At any rate, Bridget, Paige, thanks again for coordinating today and for bringing so many people together to have a conversation about various aspects of controlled drainage. This is a great opportunity. So, of course, I was ecstatic and happy to be able to share this with the panel and be able to share some of the work we've done in Grand Lake and in Lake Erie with all of the participants today. So, if anybody has a question, feel free to drop it in the chat, wait till the end for the panel, or you can just, shout it out. At any rate, I thought I would start with talking a little bit about this idea of controlled drainage. And I know we're going to hear from a few other speakers today, so I'll keep this brief. But when we talk about, saturated buffers or controlled drainage, what we're talking about is effectively changing the way that the subsurface flow happens, basically backing water up in the field. And what this translates to is raising the water table in the field. And the idea here is, can we reduce nutrient loading going into any water body? Can we reduce nutrient loading by keeping some of the gallons on the field? And these control structures, do a fantastic job doing just that. Now, when you see the sort of terms controlled drainage and you see the term saturated buffer, I want to draw like a kind of a distinction here. Saturated buffers involve controlled drainage, but not all controlled drainage involves a saturated buffer. Okay, if that makes sense, I'll say it one more time. All saturated buffers involve an aspect of controlled drainage. Not all controlled drainage involves a saturated buffer. And so again, controlled drainage is really about adjusting the water table in the field, and you're going to move that water table up and down at various points in the year, concurrent with the growing season and when you need to access the field with heavy equipment and things like that. That's what controlled drainage is all about. Extending controlled drainage is when you can sort of take some of that water that's risen up in the water table of the field and divert that laterally and allow gravity to sort of naturally percolate that water through the riparian zone. The water will follow a natural pathway, basically a 45-degree angle from the distribution tile, the lateral distribution tile, on down to the flow line of the stream. And if you have enough vegetation, you can get a variety of biological and physical processes that take up dissolved nutrients. Up until very recently, saturated buffers were most often sort of thought of in terms of nitrogen. And I think the videos that you saw, especially the first one, really talked about nitrogen. One of the reasons there's been such a nitrogen focus with saturated buffers is because buffers come to us from, a lot of different people work together to build these things and sort of prove the concept. But some of the folks that were involved very early on were in areas that were not prone to lots of phosphorus runoff. Nitrogen was much more of an issue there. And so the initial studies with this process were really nitrogen based. What we have done here in Northwest Ohio is to assess whether or not the results can be translated for nitrogen here. And in addition, can we see any improvement in phosphorus reductions? But again, that's kind of saturated buffer in a nutshell. Can we take the tile water leaving the field that's backed up using controlled drainage and divert it and let the riparian sort of process that? Involves control structure, buffer distribution tile, the actual install cost. I've got graphics and figures and stuff like this on this if you're interested in hearing about that later. But these sorts of things, they're not prohibitively expensive. We're not talking $100,000. We're talking, and everybody's situation is different, right? So if you can install your own tile, or if you've got the perfect site or good access or whatever, so the price range is going to vary a little bit. But in general, you're talking about for 1,000-foot riparian buffer, I don't know, somewhere between right around, call it 5,000 plus or minus 1 or 2,000. And there are some programs out there to help offset those costs. The specific sites that are great for a saturated buffer are the ones like you see in the bottom left. There needs to be a little bit of relief, elevation difference between the riparian and the field. Because if you back water up, you don't want to be backing it up into the field and flooding the field out. Okay, so, not every controlled drainage site is going to be great for a buffer. The site that says no on the bottom right of the slide there, that would be a good candidate for controlled drainage. But keep in mind, you would want, desperately to adjust those stop logs, and you'd want to adjust the water table in the field at various points throughout the year. You would want to drain all the water out before you got into it pre-plant. You'd want to, drain all the water off it before you got into it to harvest. And you'd probably want the water table set at about half during the growing season. And then when harvest is done and you're off the field for the winter, you'd want to stack all the logs up and bring the water table to the surface potentially. So that's kind of the conventional wisdom. And that's why the two sites are not always the same. The buffers should be about 30 feet wide. They should be stable. The stream bank needs to have a quote gentle slope. The jury is still out on what the degree is on that slope, like how steep is too steep. What does stable mean? Something may look stable, but may not actually be stable. So, certainly consult your local soil and water office if you're thinking that you might have a site that's adjacent to a stream with an existing riparian buffer that has a current tile main going straight into the stream. Consult your soil and water district. They'll be able to absolutely help you out with that. The lab group that I'm in at Lake Campus, we've had a chance to get involved with a couple of these. The first one we got involved with was funded through GLRI program, and this was in northern Mercer County. This is basically the headwaters of Lake Erie. The actual field, you can see it there. We had 2 or 3 different conservation practices going at once. The saturated buffer was one of them. The saturated buffer drainage area was about 20 acres. It was about 1,200 or so feet of buffer tile. And you can see the map down there at the bottom right. You can see the buffer. We're sort of looking long ways at it, and you can see the distribution there. We monitored water into the buffer and water out of the buffer. And in doing so, in understanding how much water goes into the buffer versus how much water comes out of the buffer via that control box, you're able to determine how much water was actually taken up by the buffer. For instance, if 100 gallons left the field and 10 gallons made it to the stream, well, that means the buffer ate about 90 gallons. And if you're doing this volumetric calculation over a period of time, you can figure out pretty quickly what the charge rate is. This particular graphic is gallons per minute. You put it whatever unit you want. We did a lot of experimentation at this site. This site was really important in establishing whether or not buffers could work, in Northwest Ohio, and what best facilitates the most gallons going into those buffers. And so the idea is that you get as much water into these things as you can, but you also don't want them to act as another drainage source. And so we did a lot of things early on, and we discovered a lot of things that didn't work. We spent 2 years playing around with things that did not work. And then after a period of 1.5 or 2 years of finding everything that didn't work, we were left with what did work. And you can kind of see that break point there in early 2018, when everything sort of starts going our way and we start capturing almost every single drop that the field was going into the buffer. All told, over the life of the project, including the early burn-in period where we were experimenting and trying to figure out what worked with the buffer, all told, we were able to capture about 1/3 of the flow. That third of the water that we were able to capture into the buffer, the next logical question is, okay, if you're able to reduce the volume of water leaving the field by 1/3, what happened to the nutrients in that third? If you captured 1/3 of it, what happened? Here's what happened. We saw 75+% reduction in nitrogen, and we saw about 80+% reduction in dissolved P. I mean, this is great. Again, most of the early literature and studies on buffers really didn't talk about P, didn't characterize P. P is a lot harder to deal with than N, because N can ultimately be denitrified and just float away into the atmosphere. P is sort of there. It stays there. And so with this particular site, we had a situation where we were able to achieve 80+% P reduction. Now, some of the questions that came out of this study was, okay, fine, the P is disappearing, but where is it going? Well, it's either getting adsorbed to the soil, boosting soil test phosphorus levels, or it's being uptaken by the riparian veg. The reality is it's probably a combination of both. So what do? Well, we need to test it. We need to figure out where it's going, where it's preferentially going, because if it's being uptaken by the plants, that seems like something that one might be able to hay the buffer, harvest it once a year for silage or something like that. But it's definitely something to be aware of. That P's got to go somewhere. So if you stop it from going to the stream, where did it go? Because that'll ultimately help determine the lifespan, the efficacy, and the maintenance costs moving forward of these projects. If you're interested in reading anything and everything about this particular project in Northwest Ohio, you can download this paper. I'll make sure the link is, I'll drop it in the chat later, but this is freely available. You can download this, you can read about it. That first study demonstrated promise of saturated buffers in Northwest Ohio, and it also demonstrated the need to provide some additional studies. The studies that happen in out in Iowa are phenomenal. It's great work, great research, but it's not as applicable to Northwest Ohio as we would probably like. The soils are just different, right? We've got lots of clay and silts up here. And so it's a logical question. Can you take something that works somewhere else and can you transplant it and port it over here to Northwest Ohio? And so working with, the same team that included, Teresa Dirksen, we got involved with a brand new saturated buffer. And this is what you saw in the video clip. And this is work that's being funded actively currently by the Blanchard River Farms demonstration project. But again, the basic objective of this was to install another buffer and figure out whether it works in another site in Northwest Ohio. Before anybody can make a sweeping recommendation, we have to have the data to substantiate that. We wanted to address some of the questions that came up from that early study, that first study. We wanted to know, where's the P going? We also wanted to know, when you look at a saturated buffer, those control boxes that divert water into the lateral, many of them are a 3-chambered control box. And so we wanted to know what was happening to the water table in the field. If you're going to put a saturated buffer system on a field and you're going to have that 3-chamber control box, there will be an impact of the water table there will be an impact on the field. And so we really wanted to study that. We really wanted to make sure that, the field wasn't getting flooded out. Okay. And it's possible that by holding some of that water back in the field and by adjusting the water table in the field, that these sorts of practices are actually having a much larger impact than what they're literally treating. In other words, the water that leaves the field and goes into the actual riparian zone may yet be but a fraction of the actual water held back in the field. So if you put one of these things in, and you say, okay, that's great. I'm going to capture 30% of the water leaving my field. That might be true, but you also might be holding back an additional 30, 40, 50% of the water that would have left your field. And so some of these control structures may well become force multipliers in the reduction of nutrients. And so that was a logical thing that we wanted to kind of test. Here's a top-down schematic of the site. The field itself, the sub-watershed, is about 28 or 30 acres, somewhere in there. That water goes through a single tile main. It gets put into a 3-chamber box, okay? So water flows into the first chamber from the field, and then it spills over that first chamber when it reaches a critical water table level. And then when it spills over into that second chamber is connected to the lateral, and you can see that in yellow there. And water will percolate. And whatever water the lateral can't take will simply outflow. It'll go into the third chamber of the box and go into the stream. And in doing so, this keeps the system from pressurizing. It keeps things like tile blowouts, if those happen, it keeps those from happening. And it keeps everybody, safe, and it keeps these things from, eating holes in pocketbooks. But regardless, we've got 28 or 30 acres draining into this, about a 1,200 or so foot buffer planted in cool season grasses. We've got a series of groundwater monitoring wells to assess the nutrient reduction efficacy of the actual buffer. And then if you notice in the bottom left-hand corner, we have a paired site here. And we're measuring on an adjacent sub-watershed, same owner, same topography, same everything, really similar drainage area, same producer. So literally the same everything. It's a really nice setup out there. But what we're doing is we are monitoring the free flow drainage from that paired site. There's no conservation practice over on that site. I mean, there's, of course, cover crops and, no-till and things like that. But there's no physical control box is what I'm saying. There's no conservation mitigation of tile runoff. And so what we're doing is we're monitoring the free flow of that site, and then we're able to compare that to the flow that leaves the actual experimental site. And in doing so, we're able to assess not only how much water the buffer takes up, we're able to assess how much water that first stop log structure holds back in the actual field. Okay. It's a couple of shots of us, building and establishing. You can see this picture is about a year old now, but the bottom right, you can see the established buffer with all the cool season grasses. You see our shining weather station in the bottom left. Helps us keep track of precipitation, which helps guide our site visits. We want to make sure we're there about 24 hours after a good rain. You can see the 3-chambered control box closed. We've got monitoring equipment in that cooler that's sort of suspended above the dirt there. And we've got the 3-chambered box that's open. You can see the wires and the pipes. That's how we measure flow and translate that over into drainage and discharge. Down there in the middle left, that's the free-flowing site. You can see the little cordage. That's our free-flowing monitor. We're only about a year into this project, a year into the monitoring. And so we don't have a lot of concrete conclusions yet. Obviously, it's a year, okay? We will have this time next year substantial things to report, and we're going to be very excited to do that. But just as a little preview, here's some of the things that we're seeing out there. We're seeing that the buffer is actively charging. Shortly after the buffer was constructed, there was some water flow issues out there, but once the buffer settled down and settled in, you can see that happened about March of 2021, about a year ago. Ever since then, we've had just phenomenal uptake rates of the buffer. In terms of how much water the buffer is actually getting, it's been great. Okay, very, very great. We can see this loads. The top of your screen is water leaving the field. That middle chamber is water getting diverted to the laterals, to the actual buffer. And then the chamber closest to us that's not getting any water, that's the water that goes to the stream. So again, the chamber at the top is water leaving the field. The middle chamber is water getting diverted to the saturated buffer. And then the chamber closest to you, the one on the bottom, if that makes sense, the chamber that has no water, if water gets in that chamber, it goes to the stream. And so this particular runoff event, 100% of the water leaving the field is being processed. Again, the paired site gives us a good estimation of how much water is being held back by that first log. The monitoring equipment in this actual box tells you how much water is going over the notches. It doesn't tell you how much water is being held back by that log. And that's what that paired site does. And again, that's one of the things that takes. That's one of the things that just takes time to sort of pour through that data and collect all that to really assess it. But here are some preliminary facts and findings that we're excited to put some more things to as we add data to it. But here's what we know after a year of monitoring. We know that we had a really dry first half of the year, right? We all lived that in Northwest Ohio. We know we had a really wet last half of the year. What we saw is that first stop log, it led to a reduction in volume of about 70%. That's tremendous. We saw that there were 11 precipitation events that fostered runoff from the field. In other words, there were 11 times when water left the field, jumped the notch, got into the buffer. That's great. During those 11 times, the saturated buffer reduced the flow volume by eating or drinking 35% of the flow leaving the field. This is really, really close to the estimate that came from the site in northern Mercer County. Okay, really close to that estimate. And I kind of like that. If you get enough sites that are similar and they're all telling you the same thing, there might be something to that. So we're sucking up about a third. So how much water leaving the field in Northwest Ohio does a saturated buffer actually able to process? And the answer is about a third, maybe a little more. Okay. How much water did that first stop log hold back to begin with? Well, maybe 70%. I mean, that's tremendous. Now, anytime you do controlled drainage and you hold subsurface water back, there is the potential for that subsurface to turn into surface and for you to have more surface flow but less subsurface flow, if that makes sense. So there's an unintended consequence that can happen there. We're actively monitoring groundwater levels. And so if the groundwater gets up to that point where it would become, quote, surface water, we'll know that. And that's another thing that we're looking at as we move forward with monitoring. Only 11 events where water actually infiltrated the buffer. During those 11 events, we saw, it's really early. I hate to even throw numbers on this yet, but we saw nutrient reductions. We saw great nutrient reductions. We were happy with them. We're excited to sort of narrow these margins in, but it's somewhere between 50 and 75%. Again, very similar to what we saw in northern Mercer County. And I do want to acknowledge, since this is an ongoing research site, a big thank you to Blanchard River Demonstration Farms, Van Tilburg Excavating and Van Tilburg Farms for helping us drill these wells, and St. Charles for being our local partner. But with that, I'll stop sharing my screen, and I don't know if there's any questions. If you want to throw them in the chat or just shout them out, and if not, we can wait until the panel.
Thanks
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, a reminder to put questions in the Q&A box if you're interested. We did get one asking about cool versus warm season grasses. I don't know if you want to touch on that for a second, and then we can also pose that question again to the Q&A panel at the end.
Yeah, I would love to pose that with the Q&A panel. In terms of the reason we went with cool season grasses was just getting them established and the survival out there at that site felt like they would do a little bit better. But certainly things that have deeper root structures would, be able to tap into and access more of that water directly. I will say, even if something doesn't have necessarily a super extensive root structure, as long as that soil is being saturated, like they're getting it. They don't have to necessarily be touching the distribution pipe. As long as that water, saturates the soil, they're going to get it at some point. Maybe not as quickly or as readily as something with a taller root structure, but literally anything is better than nothing at those sites.
Thank you. All right, so now I'm going to hand it over to my co-host Paige, who is going to switch gears, and we're going to talk about drainage water management.
Hi guys. So as Bridget said, we're going to go back into a little bit deeper into drainage water management. I have 2 videos for you all, and then we'll let Bruce speak on it. So we'll start these videos really quick.
Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for everybody joining today and talking about, these tools that we have in our toolbox. And as Stephen described, we have to match the site to the right conservation practice. And you could probably say that about any conservation practice, whether that's cover crops or how we plant crops, even how tillage is maybe by prescription, or we intentionally have a reason why tillage is occurring. And so as we match up physical structures, we match up the structure option to the site that really is going to give the best option and opportunities for the success of that practice. And so trafficability is sometimes often talked about in the field about drainage in general, but also controlled drainage. Controlled drainage and tile itself doesn't necessarily equal field trafficability for equipment. We still have to have Mother Nature helping us out, getting to that spring planting date or that optimum condition when we're harvesting and minimizing the wetness of the soil and causing compaction and maybe negatively influencing soil quality. And so when I say we need some help from the weather, we need some either evapotranspiration or just evaporation from the surface, because drainage, our tile system, really is managing that gravitational water. And that was described well in that buffer, saturated buffer example, where we're dealing with a gravitational water, and we just want to remove that excess gravitational water from a production field. And really what we want to leave behind is the available water to the plant. And so there's a balance there of, should we remove too much water, not enough? Are we in a saturated situation that causes crop damage? Well, so there's always a balance. And that's where the word management comes into play with these structures, and controlled drainage and drainage water management is certainly part of that conversation. And so soil quality has a lot to do with how the water is going to move within the soil, certainly as well. And there's 2 words that I like to reemphasize when talking about soil and water, and that is one, infiltration versus permeability. So infiltration is when we have rain droplets coming in contact with the soil, and that rain droplet has a decision to make. Is it going to infiltrate at the soil surface, then into the soil profile, or is there something there that is causing a barrier? And that water droplet decides to not move into the soil, but instead of infiltration, that water droplet is going to run off. And so with runoff, we may have an increase in soil erosion potential if that water is moving across the surface. And so a condition in Northwest Ohio today, if we have frozen ground, we may have 0 infiltration. And as it rains before a snow event, we're going to have more surface water runoff. So infiltration can be limited by soil compaction at the surface. It can be influenced by our soil quality, certainly. But then when we get into permeability, we want that water to flow through the soil profile. And then that's where our subsurface tile is in place and having an opportunity to manage that. Manage the excess water, but leave water behind for crop development and so on. So think about infiltration and the consequences of that, and then also permeability that we have naturally in our soils, and then the influence that we have as caretakers of the soil and what we can do to improve permeability within the soil profile that leads to those macro and micro pores that lead to a subsurface drainage system that we hope then is connected to, maybe in the right locations, that management structure. So my background in this area, and I guess maybe why Paige and Bridget invited me, is I've had a few opportunities in Defiance County and Northwest Ohio. Actually, back in 1996, we began a project doing subsurface irrigation, which is another level of drainage water management. Yes, we're holding water back in the field, but in subsurface irrigation, we're actually adding water back into that control structure and artificially raising the water table, not just from rainfall precipitation, but actually a source of water that is irrigating and adding water to the system. And that went from 1996 through about 2008. And so we've had control structures in Northwest Ohio and our environment doing quite well. Another project that was started in Defiance County, a controlled drainage project in 2005, that went through 2003, just looking at controlled drainage and just utilizing and managing the precipitation that was falling on that farmland, whether it's in the growing season or in the non-growing season, and using controlled drainage to manage that to improve yields potentially, but also improve water quality year round. And so I mentioned those two projects because we were both installing new construction, but also retrofitting. So controlled drainage can be done in an existing quality controlled or a drainage system. We actually did sub-irrigation on clay tile. You can actually do retrofit a control structure on clay tile. As long as that clay tile was sound and performing, we had success both sub-irrigating and using controlled structure with clay tile, and also corrugated plastic tubing, the new perforated, corrugated, the newer in design of things. And so there's a lot of opportunity. And so don't necessarily rule out that, hey, I can't do controlled drainage because X, Y, and Z, but also, again, still matching up the practice to the site that we can make it best fit. So certainly there are some differences between the saturated buffer opportunities in the sense of the concentration of that soluble nutrient. So once we have dissolved nitrogen or dissolved phosphorus in the water, controlled drainage by itself hasn't been shown to reduce concentrations, whereas a buffer, as it was described, can, by plant utilization or absorption to the soil in the buffer area, can reduce that concentration. We might get some phosphorus absorption in the production field by holding that water back. But in most cases, controlled drainage by itself is not reducing the concentration of that soluble nutrient. The benefits then, though, are really reducing the annual volume of water that's leaving that field. And so that's where the water quality improvement comes into play. But I can remember talking to several farmers and this was at church one Sunday, and we were like, praying for rain because it was getting dry. And then all of a sudden, the region received rain events. And then the farmer said, it rained, but my tile began to run. And it feels like they lost that water that they so intentionally anticipated, but yet it was gone because the drainage system removed it. And maybe because there was some preferential flow or cracking of soils. And so instead of being utilized by the crop that desperately needed that drink of water, it left the field. And that's where controlled drainage has the potential to really retain and preserve some of that water, keep it in the field during the growing season, And Ohio State has seen somewhere between 3 to 10% yield increase across corn and soybeans when it comes to controlled drainage. So it's not earth-shattering irrigation yields that you might expect in a dry year, but it can preserve that water for crop utilization. And so controlled drainage can be best utilized and incorporated in the four R's, and a nutrient management plan can be certainly part of conservation drainage. Just to wrap up here on these comments for now is just a couple of myths that people think about or incorrectly replicate as reasons why they may not want to have controlled drainage in a production system. One myth is controlled drainage is plugging the tile. Absolutely not. When we manage a structure in a controlled drainage system, it's recommended that we always allow, at a minimum, in the winter months, 12 inches of freeboard where we always have water, given the water in that field the ability to leave that farm. We do not want to increase that board all the way to the surface and leave it in that saturated condition, because remember my comments about infiltration and permeability? We don't want to cause, by nature of drainage water management, a reduction in infiltration, because that's the best filter, the best absorption of that water into our watershed. So we want that infiltration to occur. So controlled drainage by design is not plugging tile, but people do remember those devices that can be put in the end of a tile, pumped up with air to prevent maybe a manure discharge. Okay, that is in fact plugging a tile. Controlled drainage is something different. Controlled drainage causes blowouts in a field. Well, controlled drainage may elevate what a construction error might have happened, but blowouts may occur because the construction was lacking a connection. Maybe there was a poor fitting, or maybe there was a poor design on a grade of a tile, that there wasn't a particular pipe size changed when a grade occurred in a field design. So controlled drainage doesn't necessarily cause tile blowouts, but if there is an inherent weakness in the system, that the system was not designed correctly to begin with, there may be some problems that arise. Sediment in tile caused by controlled drainage. No, if a drainage system is designed properly with grade, we have enough velocity in those free drainage periods of the year that if sediment did accumulate in the tubing, that it would be flushed across that tubing and out the drain. And so it wouldn't accumulate. As we've had these projects I've described since 1996, and then again in 2005, and as we've dug and retrofitted and put instrumentation in fields that have had controlled drainage and even sub-irrigation, I personally, professionally, have not observed any significant amount of sediment in a controlled drainage field or a sub-irrigation field more than normal. We normally will have a little bit of sediment in the corrugations of corrugated plastic tubing, and that's normal for most of our fields. A couple more just myths. The control structure collapse or failures. Most of the time, that is an error at installation. If there is a bound up box or structure, it's maybe because it was backfilled incorrectly, or there was not a fitting around the rubber boots that connect the mains or the laterals and tubing to the structure itself. And so proper connections and backfilling is going to remove the risk of structure failures. And then lastly, roots in the tile. So water in a tile, a filled corrugated plastic tubing full of water doesn't necessarily invite roots to live in it. But if there's a half full tile of water with a trickle of water, this often happens when we maybe are close to a woods, but then also we have a trickle of water that creates a moist, maybe a relative humidity environment in that tubing, can cause some roots to get in there. And that may occur with or without controlled drainage structure. More commonly, though, I noted in Northwest Ohio, we have some rural residents that have their house outlet connected to field tiles. And then that constant house discharge water use creates just enough water in that tubing in the dry months that roots can be attracted to that moist environment around that tubing. And that can be one of the major causes of roots in a tile. Versus if that tile is completely full of controlled drainage water and there's no oxygen in that tubing, roots are not going to be attracted to that environment and enter that saturated tube of drainage water. So just a few comments there. We'll loop back around on some Q&A with the panel. And so we'll turn it back to Paige or Bridget.
Thanks, Bruce. That was great. I really enjoyed your myths. Yeah, we'll give you some time here at the end. I just want to go through a little bit on funding and some resources for you all, just so you guys have a quick overview. So to begin, NRCS provides funding through a federal program called EQIP, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It not only provides financial assistance, but technical assistance. And then H2O Ohio is a state program. It's a comprehensive water quality initiative launched by our governor in 2019. It's currently not offered statewide, but they plan to branch out to other parts in the future, as you've just seen recently. It's a really good idea to start by reaching out to your local NRCS office or ODA for H2O Ohio. These programs are wonderful because they bring everyone together and everyone has specific interests that they're interested in. Next, we'll talk a little bit further about the NRCS EQIP program. It provides producers with incentive contracts that offer financial assistance for adoption of conservation management practices on production land. The contracts must address at least one priority resource through the contract, which initially is 5 years. While we're on the subject of money, there are two types of payments they offer. It's either an implementation payment or an annual payment. The implementation payments are dispersed immediately after the contract's certified, and annual payments are dispersed on an annual basis on October 1st, as long as the management practices are being used. Drainage water management has been given the code 554, and then saturated buffers are 604. And they're both done on a per acre basis. The 2022 EQIP deadline's already passed. It was January 14th, but it's never too early to start thinking about next year. This is just a little quick clip of the codes, which you can get from NRCS if you want to learn more, or you can look online. They're really quick guides. And then a little overview on H2O Ohio. It was launched in 2019, as I said, and it's overseen by ODA Soil and Water. There's 10 DMPs listed. Number 7 is drainage water management, and number 9 is edge of field buffers. Again, this closed on January 15th for 2022, but it's never too early, like I said. A little deeper into the drainage water management part of H2O Ohio. For this incentive, a producer must install a structure that controls at least 10 acres of land without a submain, or 20 acres if they have a submain. The producer must also manage these structures throughout the non-growing season to mitigate nutrient runoff. Aside from the knowledge of knowing that you're doing your part to improve Ohio's water quality, there are other benefits to this practice. First, the plant available water can also be managed throughout the growing season, as you've heard from all of our speakers. And the producer will also get $1,500 per site without a submain and $4,000 per site with a submain. Additionally, the producer will get $200 per site in the second, third, and fourth year simply for managing the structures. Here's the little fact sheet. I had a hard time finding a fact sheet for the buffers for number 9 on H2O Ohio's programs, but I'm sure if you reach out to ODA, you'll be able to find that. Now we're going to jump into our panel. Bridget, do you want to take over?
Yes, thank you. All right, so we heard from Bruce and Dr. Jackman, and we also have Joe Gearing from Allen County and Aaron Healers from the Blanchard River Demo Farms Network. Feel free, guys, to unmute and say hello, and we will field some of these questions that we have in the chat in the Q&A box.
Hello, everyone. This is Joe Gearing. Appreciate OSU doing this presentation. There's a lot of good information, so glad to be part of it.
This is Aaron Heilers. I'm the project manager for the demonstration farms. And as some of the videos were shown, we are a part of some of the research and showcasing of this technology that's out there. So looking forward to any questions.
All right, we had a few in the Q&A box that were answered. If anyone wants to go back and check those out, you can read those, but I'll also open it up to the panel. Someone was wondering what the outlet boxes are made of and if their side is predicated on anticipated flow volumes. More of a structural question.
Yeah, I can sort of elaborate. I typed a response in there and put a link in there if anybody's interested in, who sells these kinds of boxes. But yeah, the boxes are just a rugged PVC. They hold up well. They don't seem to be breaking down. And the width of that PVC and then how big that box is going to be completely contingent on the size of the tile line that goes into it. This is not just for buffers, but like all controlled drainage. Those are going to be sized accordingly, and they're going to be sized specific to the pipe that's leaving the actual field.
Thank you. We also had the significance of cool season grass versus warm season grasses. If anyone else wants to elaborate on maybe the vegetation on those buffers, we could open that up for a quick overview if anyone wants to touch on that.
I'll just add to that. At the St. Charles site that Dr. Jackman spoke of, we initially thought about doing a cool season versus warm season comparison. And that was more of he touched on it a little bit of getting things established quickly. But it was also a contracting issue with FSA. That was a CRP site that, had to have a certain standard at that time. And so we kind of just decided at that point that we would stick with the cool season grasses. But I think warm season grass would be interesting to see a comparison there.
I really like the idea of anything that we can harvest and have that crop removal, because if we are allowing these roots to really take advantage of the available soluble nutrients, and then we can remove that as a crop removal, just like we have corn bushels leaving a field, corn silage leaving a field. If we can remove that nutrient in a biomass of grain or forages, that helps to redistribute that nutrient that otherwise would have been in Ohio's watershed and utilize it back into other reasons. So that and it makes it maybe a little bit of a economic opportunity for the farmer that they may not be losing out of something. We purchase farmland for X number of thousands of dollars per acre, and be honest, these practices take some of that footprint out of, you might say, the normal production. So the incentives of having value coming out of that buffer is a great opportunity, and it has a nutrient recycling conversation with it.
Yeah, Bruce, on that note about taking this drainage water that's loaded with dissolved, P or dissolved N, and then putting it back into some sort of commodity-based product, that's always attracted me, that idea with the subsurface irrigation that you were talking about. You're using the nutrients that are leaving the field to then put right back into the crop and then get that, out of the watershed. I have heard people, I don't know of any site that's actually done this yet, but I have heard people talk about these sorts of really unique notions about rotational fields when they're, low lying fields. If there are certain, like every other year, you completely flood the field and not put any crops in it, let nutrients build up, and then you'd come back. These are typically thought of in like a wetland context. But, if you had an area that was should be a wetland, if you can leave it as a wetland one year and then you can put crops in it the next year and draw those nutrients out and then let it flood or whatever rotation. But I think those subsurface ideas are unique in the recycling aspect. They appeal to me.
Carter, we had an anonymous question come in. And just a reminder, that is an option if you'd like to post something. So it says, with roughly 50-60% of Ohio's farmland being farmed in a rental or crop share agreement, are there any incentive for absentee landowners to invest in drainage water management?
I think that's a great question. Honestly, I think it's a barrier. It's a conversation that has to happen between that tenant and the landowner, because there may not be an absolute direct, value that people might see in that. And sometimes farmers invest into their own farmland, their owned property first. And so that conversation about the value of conservation between the landowner and the tenant can be very important. And the farmer may need to share some of the value of having a 3 to 10% yield improvement by having controlled drainage, by capturing some of those rainfall events for corn and soybean production. And it certainly will not, I'd rather say may not, but it will not happen every year, that yield response for just having controlled drainage. But the opportunity for the conservation side and how those incentives from NRCS, Soil and Water, other entities that can support that practice, mutually beneficial to both the landowner and the operator of the land.
Thanks, Bruce. Unless anyone else wanted to touch on that aspect, we have another question from Matthew Brown. Does anyone see automated drainage control structures being common enough and cost effective enough that they're a viable option for most producers? It's more of an open-ended question.
So I'll touch on that first. That structure that we have at Statler's that you saw briefly in that video, I know it was a little having some technical issues there. I think that structure cost about $5,000, $5,500. So obviously that's pretty pricey. That price point will come down as more and more of these things get out on the landscape. And I know NRCS if they're not already cost sharing on automation, they're probably pretty close to doing so in Ohio. So that will help offset that cost as well. We're also looking at our Kurt demonstration farm moving forward with the Edge of Field network that Kevin King manages, in implementing automation on those drainage structures there to be able to see if we can manipulate that water flow, I guess, more efficiently, and be able to show the water quality benefits of a fully managed system, automated managed system at the field scale too. So hopefully as that information comes out and the technology gets better and better, like technology typically does after a few years, then we'll see broader adoption.
We also want to highlight the importance of looking into your local soil and water, your local county offices. A lot of times they might have additional projects or funding going on, either like on a rotating or a seasonal basis that you can talk to. If some of these like larger statewide programs have different deadlines. So definitely encourage you, and you can reach out to a water quality associate as well, and we can help make those connections for you if you don't know where to start. Another question we have about specifically the saturated buffer strip. Can you harvest the grass off of it, or have like a harvestable strip used for the saturated buffer?
I'll let Dr. Jackman probably can best touch on that.
So the question is, can you actually harvest the grass off? That's going to be contingent on, what's actually planted there, and then what the conservation agreement is, right? Aaron, it's my understanding there's certain conservation agreements you can and certain ones that you can't. And so moving forward, as Bruce was talking about, if we could create some sort of a commodity-based system off that riparian, it would need to be the right contract. It would need to be the right product. And I think every time we do one of these, monitoring studies, there comes new questions. That first study from the GLRI project with Ohio EPA that brought on new questions. This study that we're working on, Teresa Dirksen and Aaron and I are working on, it's bringing up new questions, and I think that might be an opportunity for to fold into a third potential study in this area of the state.
Yeah, just to add to that. So that particular site, as I said earlier, is a CRP site. So there would be contract restrictions to harvest that just because they're already getting an incentive payment for that land taken out of production. I think big picture, as we've mentioned before, if we can get to a point where we can show the value of harvesting that material off of there because it's removing nutrients, then I think that would be a great addition to a program at some point. I think the Grand Lake St. Mary's watershed did a number of years back. They did a haying of the buffer strips, and they did some incentive work there. It might have been 10 years ago now. And that was kind of a popular program so that guys could get in, they could harvest it, get a little bit of a payment or an incentive to do that as just kind of that experimental program. So definitely, I think something to continue to keep an eye on and push for if we can show some positive results there.
I think some of Kevin King's data that you mentioned, Aaron, was that sometimes our soil test levels are an indicator of how phosphorus may be coming out of our high soil test level phosphorus fields. And so if a buffer, as was mentioned, sorbs the phosphorus and is doing a good job of collecting it and keeping it in the saturated buffer area, if that buffer continues to climb in soil test level numbers, at what point does that buffer become less effective? And so I would advocate that crop removal would be the continuation of that recycling and making that buffer capable, chemically, physically able to last longer in a system that is designed to be a significant solution over a longer period of time.
Yeah, Bruce, we're going to attempt to answer a little bit of that. I don't know how much the soil test phosphorus levels are going to change over 3 years. I mean, they're probably not going to move that much, but if something's going to happen, you will see a little bit of a hint, I think, in that short window, maybe, who knows? Anyway, my point is we took like 6-inch soil cores all the way down to 8 feet at multiple locations from the field and the buffer before we put the buffer in. And when we're done with I think we're going to sit on it for 2 or 3 years. Then we're going to go back after the monitoring period is done and look at the STP levels from those same sites.
That's awesome. Good to hear.
We'll see. We'll see what happens.
All right, we have another question that came through. Make sure to get your questions in the Q&A in the chat. We'll probably wrap it up after this one. So if you have a burning question while we have our experts on demand here, go for it. So drainage water management has been recommended to be used on a field with little to no slope. Has there been any work to look at the effectiveness of this practice on a field with more slope, or will NRCS look into this in the future?
I think that's a very fair question. Not every topography is as flat as sections of Defiance or Henry County, where we have 640 acres of Hoytville soil, just flat as you can imagine. So the topography is going to shape the design, the installation design of those. And as we have elevations that change 10 to 12 inches of elevation, to really do a substantial controlled drainage system across the landscape, we would need to have a separate zone. And so not every one of those zones would maybe require a new box. There actually is a device called a water gate that is actually it's a buried float valve that performs and does the same function as a control structure, but it's below the surface. It's not sticking the square box or round structure out of the edge of the field. It can be installed at those various zones. I know of a subsurface irrigation field in Fulton County that has 12 management zones by design, and they stair step, you might say, to make sure that each of those grades or elevations have the equal amount of sub-irrigated water. And so if our objective is to have controlled drainage at every corner of a field that has a lot of different topography or elevation changes, it would take a design that takes into account that topography. It's also going to increase the cost of that design and installation, because if we want to influence more of that field area that has the topography change, we're going to have more devices and structures that manage that water level at each of those elevation changes. Water still flows downhill. And so as we need to manage it at a level area, it's going to take some design.
That's a good question that they brought up, because we've been having that internal discussion between Dr. Jackman and some staff at NRCS, just based off of what Stephen saw in the first year at the saturated buffer site, where not a typical controlled drainage site, a lot of elevation change, but still seeing a pretty good reduction of water just at that first stage. And so we've just kind of had the internal discussions of, why is the standard the way that it is? Obviously, there has to be a point where if you're doling out the public dollars, taxpayer dollars for a conservation practice, you have to set a limit somewhere where you would have a degree of confidence that these structures, at least the existing ones, are going to get the most bang for the buck, let's say. But I think if this research continues and you can show still a pretty drastic reduction at these different elevation changes, then maybe that standard might be tweaked in the future. But we also at the Statler demonstration farm have that below ground water gate, and it's one of those things that's pretty scary. You're putting something in your tile that you can't see. And I know they had a little hiccup here and there with it, had to go back in and replace it because the gate just got stuck in the closed position, unfortunately. So they had to do some investigation there. So not, everything that's mechanical can go wrong at some point. So just things to think about.
Thank you, everyone. We're going to move on to Paige to wrap us up and get everyone their CEU credits that joined us today. But thank you guys for providing your expertise, and we're glad to put these guys on your radar. And like I said, act as an in-between if anyone is interested in learning more or getting connected to some of these programs and practices. So take it away, Paige.
Yeah, thanks everyone. That was an awesome panel. Really quick, we have our EET reminder for everyone. This is a teaching event for Bridget and I. So if you guys could go through and either follow the link Bridget's going to drop in the chat, or you'll get an email after this to remind you to submit an evaluation. If you all could just kind of go through and tell us how you think we did teaching wise. Public input meeting that we're having coming up. We just wanted to take a moment to invite you all. There's a Go link down at the bottom. It's go.osu.edu/input meeting. We really want to get the public input on these areas. Even if you're not in the area and you want to join, you're more than welcome to. But the map is on here with the areas that we're focusing on. And we really hope to see you guys there. It's coming up here in mid-February. And then we just like to say thank you